Some patterns don't show up. They show up together. Needs that feel complicated. Feelings that feel uncertain. Attention that's always outward. And guilt that appears when you try to pull away. Most people encounter these pieces separately. They try to fix one without seeing the others. Or they blame themselves for patterns that were never random. This video brings these experiences together, not as problems to solve, but as adaptations that once helped things stay steady. You don't need to watch this all at once. You don't need to agree with it. Just notice what settles as the pieces line up. This is the eye behind the curtain. Why you felt guilty for having needs. Some people grew up feeling guilty for needing anything at all. Not because they were demanding. Not because they were ungrateful. But because needing felt complicated. Nothing dramatic may come to mind. No clear moment you can point to. Just a quiet feeling that showing up fully wasn't safe. In this video, we're going to look at where that feeling comes from, and why it still shows up long after childhood is over. For a lot of people, the confusing part wasn't that their needs were rejected. It was that sometimes they were met, and sometimes they weren't. Love didn't disappear, it just became conditional. You might remember being praised for being an easy kid, for not asking for much, for understanding situations that weren't actually yours to manage. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, you learned something important. Your needs had a cost. Children adapt brilliantly. If expressing a need creates tension, distance, or emotional withdrawal, they stop expressing it. Not consciously, automatically. You may have learned to scan the room before speaking, to sense when it was a good time to want something and ask for it, to downplay disappointment before anyone else had to deal with it. This wasn't weakness, it was intelligence. Here's the part most people miss. You didn't stop having needs, you just started carrying them quietly. This is the emotional reframe. Don't rush it. As an adult, this can show up in small, familiar ways. A tightness in your chest when you think about asking for help. An apology forming before you've even decided what to say. That quiet urge to minimize what you're feeling, to tell yourself it isn't a big deal. You might notice a reflex in your body. Rest doesn't feel neutral. It feels loaded. Clarity feels like something you have to earn. Consistency can feel like asking for more than you should. Not because these wants are unreasonable, but because your childhood trauma wound remembers a time when needing something came with a cost. This isn't about blaming anyone. It's about understanding why something that seems so simple now never felt simple then. When a child learns that love came easier when they ask for less, they grow into an adult who feels safest disappearing just a little. Why you learn to doubt your own feelings. Some people learned too early not to trust their own feelings. Not because they were dramatic. Not because they were wrong. But because their emotional inner experiences were quietly questioned. Again and again. Nothing obvious may come to mind. No single moment you can point to. Just a sense that certainty inside yourself never quite felt safe. In this video, we're going to look at how that happens, and why self-doubt can still show up even when you're trying to trust and be honest with yourself. Most people don't grow up being told directly that their feelings and reactions are wrong. It's usually subtler than that. A reaction that's ignored, an emotion that's minimized, a moment where your emotional reactions are corrected instead of understood. Over time, something shifts. You stop asking, "What do I feel?" and start asking, "What's acceptable to feel?" Children adapt in ways that keep connection intact. If your feelings create confusion, discomfort, or emotional distance, you don't stop feeling. You start adjusting. You learn which emotions are easier to have, which reactions get met with less resistance, which parts of you make the room feel calmer. Over time, that adjustment becomes automatic. Not because it's false, but because staying connected once mattered more than staying clear. You might learn to explain yourself carefully, to doubt your first reaction, to look outward for confirmation before trusting your own thoughts on any given situation. Not because you lack insight, but because trusting yourself during childhood came with consequences. Here's the part most people miss. Self-doubt didn't appear randomly. It was learned. And what's learned while being a child can feel automatic in adulthood, even when the original environment is long gone. As an adult, this can feel like living slightly outside yourself. Second-guessing your reactions, replaying conversations to see if you were too sensitive, wondering if your discomfort is justified or imagined. You will notice certain feelings in your body at first, like a tightening when you try to speak honestly, a hesitation before naming what you feel, a reflex to ask for reassurance instead of trusting your own signal. This isn't a flaw. It's what happens when a child doesn't receive clear emotional feedback, when feelings are met with inconsistency, correction, or silence. Without clarity, self-trust doesn't disappear. It never fully gets built. When your feelings are repeatedly corrected or dismissed, inner certainty doesn't disappear. It learns to stay silent. In the next video, we'll look at how this pattern often turns outward, why so many people who doubt themselves become deeply attuned to other people's emotions. Not because they're weak, but because paying attention once felt like the safest way to stay connected. Why you feel responsible for other people's emotions. Some people became very good at noticing other people's emotions, not because they were naturally selfless, not because they wanted control, but because attention once felt necessary. Nothing related to dramatic situations may come to mind. No traumatic memories you can refer to. Just a quiet habit of scanning the room, because letting your guard down didn't feel safe. In some homes, emotional stability wasn't consistent. Moods shifted. Tension lingered. Silence meant something. Children coming from this type of environments learned quickly. They learned to read tone, to notice subtle changes, to sense when something is off before anyone says a word. Not because they're anxious, but because awareness once helped them feel prepared for what came next. Children learn early what helps the room feel safer. If someone else's emotional state affects the room, you learn to track it. You might learn to smooth things over, to adjust yourself before tension grows, to become quieter, calmer, or more agreeable when needed. Over time, that attention turns into a role. You become the one who notices, the one who anticipates, the one who keeps things from tipping too far. Here's the part most people miss. This isn't caretaking by nature. It's caretaking by learning. Responsibility didn't come from generosity and kindness. It came from necessity. As an adult, this can feel like being constantly alert. While on calls and meetings, or even on casual conversations with friends, You notice shifts in tone. You feel tension before others do. You sense when someone is upset, even if they say they're fine. Your physical responses may alert you by feeling a tightening when someone seems distant, or a pull to fix things before they're broken, and finally, the reflex to take responsibility, even when it isn't yours. Staying uninvolved can feel uncomfortable, because part of you is still watching. This wasn't a mistake or a weakness. Paying attention once helped you feel safer. It helped you anticipate what was coming. Over time, vigilance didn't fade. It became automatic. In the next video, we'll look at where this often leads, why distance can feel like betrayal, and why setting boundaries can trigger guilt instead of relief. Not because you don't value yourself, but because closeness once depended on staying available. Why emotional distance feels like betrayal. Some people struggle deeply with distance, not only physical, but emotional as well. Not because they don't value independence, not because they're afraid of being alone, but because pulling back once felt like a risk. Like a familiar discomfort when someone feels distant, a feeling that connection might be slipping, even when having your own space is reasonable. In this video, we're going to look at how that happens, and why boundaries can trigger guilt instead of relief. In some environments, emotional closeness wasn't optional. Emotional availability was expected. Attention was noticed. Distance meant something. You may not remember being told you couldn't step away, but you might remember what happened when you did. A change in tone, a subtle withdrawal, a tension in the room that didn't get explained. No drama, no confrontation, just a sense that stepping back affected the atmosphere. Over time, you learned that emotional distance didn't feel neutral. It started to feel loaded, like it carried consequences you couldn't quite name, but learned to anticipate. Children learn what keeps emotional connection steady. If your physical presence prevents tension or emotional fallout, you stay close. You learn to be available, to respond quickly, to remain emotionally present even when you're tired. Not because you don't need a healthy space, but because stepping away for a while once came with consequences. Here's the part most people miss. Distance didn't feel neutral. It felt like abandonment. And boundaries didn't feel protective. They felt dangerous. As an adult, this can show up quietly. Guilt when you don't respond right away. Anxiety when you need time to yourself. A sense that pulling back means you're doing something wrong. You will feel it in your body before it manifests in your mind. A tightness when you say no. Restlessness when you claim your healthy space. A pull to re-engage before you're ready. Even when the boundary is reasonable, it doesn't feel safe. What makes this especially confusing is that part of you wants to distance yourself, but another part reacts immediately. As if taking your own distance will cost you something you can't afford to lose. This is why reasoning your way through it rarely works. You can know that space is healthy. You can believe that boundaries are reasonable, and still feel unsettled the moment you create them. Because the reaction isn't coming from belief, it's coming from memory. You learned a long time ago that staying close reduced uncertainty, that staying available kept things stable, that pulling back changed the atmosphere in ways that didn't feel safe. So even now, distance doesn't register as a natural thing. It registers as risk. None of this means you don't value independence. It means independence arrived without a sense of safety attached to it. And without this sense, space never gets to feel like relief. The desire of spending time alone isn't selfishness. It feels like it because you learned from childhood that closeness with your caregivers once helped maintain stability in the family environment, and then you grew up staying always available to reduced uncertainty. See the pattern? Space didn't feel like self-care. It felt like a threat to connection. In the final video of this series, we'll bring all of this together: how needs, feelings, attention, and distance became linked, and what it means to begin untangling them without blaming yourself for how you learned to cope. When everything became connected. Some people sense that everything in their life is connected, but they've never been able to explain how. Their needs feel complicated. Their feelings feel uncertain. Their attention is always outward. And distancing oneself brings guilt instead of relief. In this video, we're not going to add anything new. We're just going to notice how these pieces fit together and why none of them means something is wrong with you. At some point, these experiences stopped feeling like individual struggles. They became one system, yours. If your needs once felt heavy, you learned to keep them small. If your feelings were questioned, you learned to double-check them. And when the environment felt unpredictable, attention became the safest place to stand. None of these patterns formed in isolation. They responded to each other. Over time, these adaptations began to work as a unit. If you couldn't fully trust your needs, you looked outward. If you couldn't fully trust your feelings, you scanned the room. And if attention helped maintain connection, pulling away felt risky. What looks like overthinking, people-pleasing, or fear of distance is often one system trying to stay balanced. Not perfectly, just consistently. Here's the part most people never hear. These patterns didn't form randomly. They formed together. And because they form together, they make sense together. This your emotional center, let it breathe. This is also why insight can feel strangely uncomfortable at first. When you start to see the pattern, you might expect relief. But instead, you may feel exposed, or uncertain, or quietly untethered. Because the system that once kept things steady is no longer working in the background. And without replacing it, awareness can feel like standing without a railing. Nothing here needs to be undone. These patterns don't need to be fought, erased, or corrected. They were ways of staying connected, ways of reducing uncertainty, ways of keeping the room steady. And the fact that they're still present doesn't mean you're stuck. It means something once worked and not anymore. If there's anything to take from this series, it isn't a solution. It's context. Context is what allows things to soften without being forced. And sometimes that's enough to begin healing. This was the eye behind the curtain. If something clicked, sit with it. This channel doesn't diagnose, it observes.